thank you for coming tonight for Dr. Paul's presentation, and it's called The History of Wisconsin and the Dawning of the Dairy Industry. And here is Dr. Dettloff.
Good. Well, welcome. I've put on meetings in hay barns and in Amish woodsheds and all over America working with Organic Valley and Dr. Paul's lab, so I think this crowd is probably shined up as good as I've seen. You really all must have hit the shower before you came. Lauren, you're particularly glowing there. So,
I've got the hair on top of it.
yeah. Well, good. Well, this is kind of my travels and what I've been exposed to. As you know, I practiced 35 years, and then I went to work for Organic Valley, and they sent me all over Canada, U.S., they sent me to the Netherlands. I went to New Zealand and Australia on my own, developed Dr. Paul's along with that, which I have sold, my wife and I have sold to my daughter at Mazomanie, and she's doing very well. So that was a mistake because now she is my boss. So I started hunting arrowheads when I was 9 years old on our farm. We had a campsite on our farm in Minnesota, and have pursued that, and I've planted a lot of trees, so I've had a kind of a biodiverse background. I'm at the point in life where I want to pass on my knowledge to the younger people. I have to thank my IT department. I've got two IT departments because I have a statement that some of you older people may want to borrow, in that I'm uncomfortable electronically. So I want to thank Jenny Service. She has a graphic design department. I put out a newsletter and she works with that, and I asked her to help design this, so I have to thank her. So, punch it away. This is John Muir. John Muir was born and raised by Portage, Wisconsin in the 1800s. He was a genius. He built the clock in 1848 that he took to Wisconsin State Fair. He was a vagabond that traveled, and he was a student of nature. He was the one that in Glacier Park figured out that we had 4 periods of glaciation across continental United States. Just common sense and geology. I will pass things around. I also collect books, but here is one of his many books. And he was raised at Portage. Here is the last glacier that covered America. Here's this Green Bay lobe. And if you look, that's right here. See this lobe right here? My birthplace was right here. We were covered under a mile of ice. And I was born and raised on a flat land prairie farm in Minnesota. Can you hear me, Larry? Okay, I'll talk loud. And this is Wisconsin's driftless area, right here. And it starts about at Ellsworth, goes over to Osseo, kind of comes down, and Hickston's over here. And this goes all the way down along the river, and it gets into Illinois. This driftless area, Paleo man, was in here very, very early. Next. Here, during the 4th glacier, the Wisconsin Glacier, the Aleutian Islands, here's Russia, the Aleutian Islands, a string of islands, was under ice. And Paleo man, who came out of Asia and Africa, migrated across here, and this is called Beringia. This landmass was called Beringia. And that melted away around 25 to 20 to 15,000 years ago. Okay? My brother after he got out of the Navy, worked for he was a helicopter man, repairman in the Navy. He worked for a private firm that was on Attu Island, and they were watching the Russians. My brother was there for a couple years after the Navy. Next one. They did not migrate along the coast because you've got the Cascade Mountains, you've got the Rocky Mountains, you've got the Sierra Nevadas, and so there may have been some early occupation along the coast, but not significant. They came across the mountains up here. There aren't many. There's a passage by Alaska, and they migrated down through here. Here's Wyoming. Here's New Mexico. And they came in here. Next slide. Here's how Native Americans, around 1300 BP, they came in, and they were after mammals, big mammals. These were paleo hunters. Paleo, they were nomadic. They were very good at identifying plants and animals. They were mainly with spears. Now, Darby is an archaeologist and follows this, and they have been pushing this back. They thought it was 13,000. This should be 13,500. We messed up on that. You know that? I messed up on that. So anyway, now they've got it back. This just came in the mail 2 days ago, Archaeology magazine, in Douglas, Wyoming, where that path was. They have discovered paleo campsite with paleo tools dated back to 16,000 years with carbon dating. It's getting older and older. And they made a specific point, or specific arrow points. And I'll pass this around. And here is a chart of what the tools were like. You can pass these around and look at them. Now, at about 8,000 BP, they do not figure the birth of Christ in archaeological time for Native Americans. It's BP, before present. So at 8,000 BP, they started to settle in family groups, in clans. And they did not have a bow and arrow. Here they had a spear, and here they developed an atlatl. This is an atlatl from New Zealand, and what it does, they had dart points. It was about a 12-inch stick with a bone projectile on it, and it had a notch in it, and this gave you more torque, and you could just really whip it. In Colorado, at the gun clubs out there, they will have atlatl contests in the summer, where they'll set up a target and they'll see who can be the most accurate, and you can really get a lot of velocity with this. The bow and arrow was not invented until 2000 BP. Okay, and this is called the Archaic area, from 8 to 2000, from 2000 to present. This is called the Casino era, but the Woodland era were sedentary agriculturists. And they had what's called the trifecta, and that was corn, beans, and squash came in from Mesoamerica, and they would put fish in. And that's what the Pilgrims found when they got in 1642 in America. They were planting corn, squash, and beans in one hill, and they'd put a fish in it for nitrogen. They knew that fish, personal observation is the most reliable source of truth. And somebody stumbled onto that years ago. And so this is kind of their history. Now, these artifacts, with carbon dating that, artifacts change through time. I guess I don't have that here. I do have a veterinary question that came in today. And I'm going to send this around, and I want you to tell me what I have to do for this bull. So just take a look at that. I think, Lauren, you're probably going to figure it out. So. I have a good friend that gets into artifacts with me. And this is where did you find it? Jim Lisinski brought this for your on your farm. And this is a stromatolite. And it's 500 million years old. Yep, that's.
Wisconsin used to be underwater,
Yeah.
Low shallow sea at one time.
There's a lot of different things. This is a very geological rich area. This unglaciated area that we're in, the non-glaciated driftless area. That's the word I'm looking for. Okay, native populations. This is very interesting. In 1492, they estimate there were 60 million Native Americans spread across the United States. 60 million. If you got 50 states, that's a lot of millions per state. In 1650, with measles, smallpox, and alcohol, there were 6 million left. And then the buffalo took out a big chunk. The demise of the buffalo they starved. In 1800, they were down to 600,000 Native Americans in the United States. Now they have bounced back. 2020, there's 6.8 million and growing. So we don't, our prejudice to the Native Americans is kind of behind us. Now, first question they ask, well, what kind of Indians was here? Indians, have you ever seen that puzzle that's out with the United States with all the tribes on it? There's like a plethora of tribes. And the tribes are identified in little clans, but they're identified by the dialect, the language they speak. And the Native Americans in this area, the Sac and the Fox, the Chippewa, the Winnebago, the Ottawa, the Menominee, they spoke the Algonquin dialect, so they could interchange. When you go east, they spoke the Iroquois, and that was the Hurons, the Mohawks, the Iroquois, Senecas, and I can't remember the fifth one, but they spoke that dialect. When you go west into Minnesota, that's the Sioux dialect. Crazy Horse was the Lakota Sioux. There was the Brule Sioux, Sitting Bull. The Sioux were the ones that got Custer. Their dialect is different. So we had, and there's all kinds of little family clans with a little different twist, but they could understand with some difficulty. One could kind of pick out the other language. But this area right here, I know in the Newcomb Valley, the old natives or locals talk about Funmaker. Funmaker lived just past Newcomb Valley, between my place on the hill and Newcomb Valley. That's where Funmaker had. And he went to some funerals. He lived to be quite old, and he was here in the 1800s when the settlers came, the Funmaker of the Winnebago. Okay, next one, Jenny. Here is that magazine I'm passing around. This is in Douglas, Wyoming. This is being excavated today. Last year, they came up in that magazine with paleo artifacts, and they carbon dated them back to 16,000 years ago. And this is just new hot stuff. Darby is an archaeologist, and I'm going to send that to him. But very interesting. Next slide. Okay, man, Africa, Homo sapiens, think Africa. The leader was Louis Leakey. Louis Leakey went to the Olduvai Gorge in Central Africa, and that's where Paleo man evolved from. And they have a whole series they've gotten. This has been followed extensively. Him and his wife, his son Richard, and this Olduvai Gorge is the meeting of two different geological areas. And it's very ancient. Next slide. Prehistoric man. This is a Neanderthal man. He was common in Europe. Simultaneously, there was another subspecies of hominids that evolved that were Cro-Magnon. The Cro-Magnon had larger brain cavities where he went extinct. They could interbreed. Has anybody read any of the books of Jean Uhl? Cave bears, mammoth hunters. She's written novels about Paleo man with the Cro-Magnon and Neanderthal. He went extinct. Cro-Magnon progressed on. This is Lucy. This is Lucy. Lucy has been documented to be a bipedal female, not quite a little over 4 feet tall, but she was bipedal. She had a brain case. She was 3.1 million years old that came out of Olduvai Gorge. And they were spears. They had spears. Next slide, please. Here is an auroch. This auroch was domesticated on the steppes of Russia. What are the steppes of Russia? Grasslands. Why there? Because the rumens made for grass. Grass and hay, forage. They could take hay and grass and turn it into meat and milk. Not grain, not corn silage. Amen. Corn silage is a blessing to the veterinary medicine world. They just don't. If you feed all grass and don't push them, these cows, they last forever. This was excavated. This is in Copenhagen, Denmark, but that's the auroch. Now that bovine went into two species. You had Bos taurus, which was in Europe. All the European cows, the Guernsey, the Jersey, the brown Swiss, the Shorthorn, the Ayrshires were European. Bos indicus went to Africa. There's two species. The reason that is important is all of the cattle that came to the United States came from Europe, and Europe had a dust cloud about 5,000 years ago that put a volcanic erosions on the top of the Mediterranean. You've heard of Pompeii in 79 AD. Pompeii was buried with lava and ash, and that wasn't the one that did it, though. That was previous to that. The bovine mutated its protein in its milk from lack of sunshine because there was no vitamin D. And the protein in milk, you've all heard in 8th grade science that protein is amino acids hooked together. There's 209 amino acids in the protein in milk that we make cheese out of. Number 67 was proline, and the C's and the O's and H's got mixed up, and it became cysteine, a different amino acid. The bond between cysteine and number 66, isoleucine, is weak, and in presence of pasteurization or digestion in the stomach, the casein protein molecule breaks apart and it drags along 6 more little amino acids in the body, and those amino acids cause a human inflammatory reaction, big time. All of the glands, the thyroid gland, the adrenal gland, all of the glands are affected by this little protein. Now, humans are A2A2. Every one of you females in this room is an A2A2. This cow that mutated, she's called an A1. And where this really came to light in my world is that 60% of our business at Dr. Paul's is with the Amish. And the Amish nurse their children. If they don't have ability, their sister does. And they all have 8 to 10 children. Or there'll be a midwife or a nurse, a wet nurse they call them. And so they usually nurse for about 10 months as birth control. And when they take little Johnny or little Lydia and bring in some cow's milk, a Holstein or something that's A1, they are miserable. They'll get a rash. I think he's teething. They'll get colicky. They're just a miserable little kid. You take that A1 milk from the cows away, give them goat milk or human milk, they get better. Fonterra, the largest milk company in the world, they market all of New Zealand and 95% of Australia's milk. They knew about this, and they were wondering, what is this deal? They hired a PhD from Christchurch in New Zealand to check into it. He did what's called an epidemiological study. People in Africa, those cows are still A2. And some Guernseys and some Jerseys were A2 because they were on the western edge of the cloud, the dust cloud. And so who really fueled the A2A2 program was China. China, 35, 40 years ago, said we want 1 child per family. Guess what? They're running out of workers. It did not work. China is now said we better have 2 children, and they don't want to lose any children. They have built plants in New Zealand to powder A2A2 dried milk for their children in China. We are the last country on this globe to catch on to this. Europe, Denmark, Germany, Sweden, Britain, all know about A2A2. Our corporate America, don't let this out, we're selling A1 milk, but the A2A2 milk phenomena is growing. That was kind of an extra, I guess, you got tonight. Next one, pigs. Pigs. In the early 1900s, pigs were extremely fat, and they came out of China. So we got the bovine from Russia, the Homo sapien from Africa, and now we got pigs from China. My parents were married in 1935, the middle of the Depression. It's an advantage to be raised by Depression parents. I found a penny in front of, what's the gas station my wife worked at? Yeah. Say that again.
Holiday Station?
Yeah, Holiday. I'm 81. You got to give me credit. I had the thought of it, okay? Anyway, I still pick up pennies. We were taught you don't waste anything. You ate your plate. You want to see what my first dinner pail in 1948 was? We were 12 miles from George A. Hormel plant. There's my dinner pail. Pass that around. Roger Campbell had one. This is an 8-pounder because my mother would put a little jar of milk in it, and the 5-pounder was too small. Roger Campbell had a 5-pounder, and he wished he could get an 8-pounder so he could have milk like me. But that was my dinner pail. So anyway, next one. Where did grain come from? Mesopotamia. And that is where we have an earthquake right now. Turkey, Syria, the Middle East. Isn't that devastating, that earthquake? Wow. Wow, that's a tragedy. But that's where the wheat and that came from. Next slide. Okay. Let's talk about the first non-native person in Wisconsin. He came down the St. Lawrence Seaway. He was a French person, came all the way here. They had canoes, and he had 7 Huron Indians bringing him down, and he lit at Green Bay, Wisconsin. Where is it, Green Bay? Here. Right down here. Here, Green Bay. Next slide. He was a Jesuit. A Jesuit, they called him the Black Robes, and he came to Christianize the savages in the United States. We didn't realize how smart those people were and how connected they were to Mother Earth. And that was in 1834. That's Jean Nicolet. Next slide. 20 years later, here he arrived in 1634 with 7 Huron natives in Green Bay. That became a military fort, Fort Howard. Next slide, Jen. So then after that, in 1654, 20 years later, 2 more Jesuit priests came, and they came with voyagers, and these were trappers, and they brought rum to trade for hides and kettles and anything from the Iron Age. But that was the first demise of the Native Americans, was when we introduced alcohol. And they set up forts. Next slide. This is Fort Winnebago. And that was set up very early in the 1800s, or late, actually in the 1700s, at Portage, Wisconsin. Portage, Wisconsin was a very significant landmark in Wisconsin because you've got the Wisconsin River going here down to the Mississippi. 6 miles over is the headwaters for the Fox River that goes up to Green Bay into the St. Lawrence, the Great Lakes, and that could go out to the St. Lawrence Seaway. And they talked in the 1800s, we need a canal, a 6-mile canal, and it would hook up the Great Lakes with the Gulf of Mexico. It never got, that's why they had a portage. That's where Portage. Fort Winnebago was set up very early for the fur trappers. Next slide. Fort Crawford at Prairie du Chien, where the Wisconsin joins the Mississippi. Huge, huge Native American settlement. When Darby was going to La Crosse University in archaeology, they made many, many trips to Prairie du Chien. It was a huge settlement, as was La Crosse. La Crosse was a huge agricultural settlement of Native Americans, as was Trempealeau, Buffalo County. This area, the upper area of the Driftless area, was heavily populated with Paleo man. Next slide. Then we got at Trempealeau. Francis Perot came on later, and he was there strictly for furs and hides. And they've excavated his fort. And that was set up in 1795. Perot was later, and he was later there. And this is his family. And he was a Jesuit. He was the first one that became aware of the lead deposits on the Wisconsin-Illinois border. the Native Americans were digging up raw lead, and they would put it on top of branches and stuff, and lead has a very low melting point, and it would melt, and they would bring in chunks of lead to the forts and trade. They'd trade furs and lead for their goods or their rum or their kettles or whatever. They were Stone Age and we were the Iron Age. And so, and he became aware that there's lead south of here, which I'm going to expound on later. Next slide. Here's Fort Perot, 1680, furs, beaver, muskrat, and otter. And the Mississippi went on the north side of that Trempealeau mountain. And Trempealeau means land in the water. The French, Trempealeau is a French, and this was in the river, Trempealeau Mountain. Now it's all filled in. So it's, there's no water there, any part of it. Next slide. So, later on, this fur trapping gets to be quite a deal. And there's some London investors headed by George Simpson that settled in Montreal, and they started a trading company all the way across the northern part of the U.S., the Hudson Bay Company. At the same time, there was a guy by the name of Alexander Mackenzie. He started the Northwest Trading Company in competition with them and set up forts all over. I'm going to show you my prize. I think I'm going to lay this over here and you look at it. This book was written by George Simpson, right there, in 1847. First edition. It's signed by James A. Simpson, his son. And he bequeathed it in 1855 to a Mrs. Davidson. A Mrs. Davidson bequeathed it to Connie Ford, president of the Lachine Museum, Lachine. There's a museum in Montreal called the Lachine Museum. And how it left there, I don't know. But I ended up buying this 10 years ago, signed 1847. I paid $300 for this book. And the binding is good. Every page is here. This is history. I'm not going to pass this around because these pages, I will lay them. Jenny's got the books that I have that I've written here. So feel free to look at that when you're done. It isn't that I don't trust you. It's just I was born poor, and so it's my excuse. So that started the rendezvous. I got a good pointer here. I make walking sticks, but see my duck? Yeah, that's so I don't quack up here. Here's the rendezvous. The fur trappers were going to go to Montreal to get their goods. And so those two companies, they started in 1819. They picked a spot in the Northern Rockies, usually at where two rivers met, and they'd say, we're going to have a rendezvous. Tell all your people and hunters and that, Jim Bridger and all of them, the frontier men and the Indians also. And there would be 1,000 people to come and they would trade, and they'd all bring their hides in and trade for goods. And they went on till 1840. Pierce Hole, they had 3 or 4 of these at, and that's in southeast Idaho. And a lot of these rendezvous points are historic points. As you travel out west, there's maps that'll show you where the rendezvous from 1824 and 25, and they kept moving around, and it was quite a celebration. A lot of whiskey traded and a lot of squaws traded, and there's a lot that went on. That was their 4th of July. It was always in the summer or early fall. Next slide. Here's buffalo robes. They were shot off in the 1850s, 60s, and 70s. Here's beavers. Do you know how they tan those? They tan those with hemlock tannins. You know what was in the 3 trees that were in the northern 40% of Wisconsin? Maple, white pine, and hemlock. Hemlock, when you boiled the bark and the cambium or little branches, it gave off tannin, and that tannin would hook up with the collagen. Collagen is like scar tissue in the hide, and it would turn it a reddish brown. And they loved that it was insulating, and they wouldn't dry out, and they didn't lose their hair, but they looked really nice color. So we'll get into that, okay? So John Jacob Astor came along after Simpson and McKinsey, and he made literally millions off the hides. John Jacob Astor. He was before Carnegie, and Carnegie made money on steel, and the Rockefellers made money on oil. He made money on hides. Next slide. Okay, so Perot found out about this lead, and here's Dubuque. Here's Mineral Point. The government in the early 1800s declared all lead mines our government property. We had just gone through the Revolutionary War in 1776. We'd gone through the War of 1812. We had exhausted the natural outcroppings of lead on the eastern U.S., and it was just chunks of lead that were down in this area. Here's Cassville. This is Iowa. This is Illinois, and this is where the lead mine was here. They picked Mineral Point as the government office, and if you wanted to lease a lead mine, it was $1.25 per acre. Next slide. And they took it out of your smelters. Raw lead has a very low melting point, and they found now archaeologically that the Indians were melting this down. They've got places down there where they put a little culvert of rocks, and there'd be a hole there, and they'd have an iron kettle or something from the fur traders, and they would cook this lead, and they'd get chunks of lead, and they would trade with the trading posts. Now, the first lead miners that came in there was right after 1800, and they would dig a hole, say from here to Jenny, down 4 feet, and they would pile branches and anything that would burn, and they would include lead in that, and they'd get this roaring fire, and that lead would melt down into that hole, and that was called pig lead. And they would ship pig lead, and they had smelters, and smelters were where they would take the pig lead and make it into different things. Now, early man, here is a bullet hole mold from an 1850 45-70 gun, a Civil War sniper's gun that I have that was made in Eau Claire, Wisconsin by Herman Schlegelmilch. I bought it from Neil Bremer. Anybody ever see his gun in the basement? That is a rare, there's only 3 of them made by this gunsmith in Eau Claire, and this is the bullet mold. And so you pass this around and you'll see a little round ball. That was for like a 45 caliber round ball. This one here's a projectile with a point. And they would pour this lead in here and let it cool and then open it up. And that was their missiles for these were post flintlock. These had a cap. You put a cap, and that was a spark that would go into the powder. You put a powder in, and then you put a wad, then you put your bullet in, and then you put a cap on this nipple, and it would click, and it would send a spark down, and they would shoot a long ways, and they were very accurate. But here is a bullet mold that this gentleman made in 1850 in Eau Claire. Here is a bullet that it would shoot. I'm going to tell you a story about this. 76 and 1812, in this fort in Trempealeau, Perot knew about it in the late 1700s, okay, in this pig iron. Next slide, please. Oh, then here's a shot tower. Thank you, you didn't move. They found that in the Civil War and that, you had what was called grape shot, and that's little round balls of lead. How they made grape shot is they would get along the bank of the Mississippi or the Wisconsin River where there was a bluff, and they'd come in, and sometimes it would be almost a straight drop off, but this is a schematic, and then they would have a tower, and they would take this molten lead and they would pour it down here, and as it falls, it would land in a kettle of cold water. And this is what you would get, is how grape shot was made. And about 40% of that was the right size that they could put in. Like in the Civil War, they had these cannons with grape shot, and they'd put in balls, and they were very lethal. And so then they would take the stuff that was too small and remelt it. There's a shot tower park by Arena, Wisconsin, which is just east of Richland Center. And there's a shot tower there. And this is quite an industry. Platteville has a museum. If you want to take a weekend and go to Platteville, it's a whole museum on the lead industry. Next slide. Now, the miners that came were mainly French, and they weren't very friendly to the natives. And I'm going to pass this around. This is a bullet that got shot into a barricade of logs. And I'll tell you more about that later. But that's a lead bullet that was shot in 1832. So, in 1830, our government said, we have a problem with these miners and the Indians, and they arbitrarily said, we want all Native Americans west of the Mississippi by 1834. So in 1832, Black Hawk had a village in northern Illinois on the Rock River. He was a sedentary man with squash, corn, beans. There was about 600 of them in an agriculture community living in wickiups. And the Illinois infantry went in there and said, get out. And they burnt the wickiups and they destroyed their food. And they fled, and they went up to the Four Lakes region, which is where Madison is. Lake Monona, Lake Mendota, and two other lakes, and they set up camp there after 1830, and so it got to be 1832, and they said, you're not across the river, and they sent the Illinois infantry, and there were two soldiers in there. One of them was 24-year-old Abraham Lincoln. One of them was older, it was Andrew Jackson, and they were future presidents. They attacked the wickiups and got rid of the food and burnt, and they made a run for it, and they got from Madison to the Wisconsin River. Next slide. And they made a stand on here's some hills right here. There's hills right here. Here's a marshy area. Here's the Wisconsin River up here. Black Hawk said, I need 30 hours to get my squaws and babies and old men across the river, because they meant business. So they hid 80 braves in this cattails and marsh. This is still here today. When Megan went to take over Dr. Paul's, she's down by Madison, she bought 9 acres, and there's a road right here. This is County Y. See, here's Sac City right here, and you go across You go down 1 mile and you take this road here. Megan bought 9 acres here. This is where Dr. Paul's warehouse is and Megan Dettloff's house. That lead missile that you see being passed around was found with a metal detector on my daughter's land. And this is where, this G is where Black Hawk stood and managed the battle and held them for 40 hours, 36 hours. They lost 50 some here. They inflicted quite a few casualties on the Illinois. They had, this is a smooth bore after the flintlock, and they would put a cap. It would hit down here. These were accurate. These were accurate. So I will be doing some metal detecting down there this summer. Then they went straight west. The infantry thought they went down the Wisconsin River. And they monkeyed around 2 days, and they didn't go down. They headed straight west across. And if you go to the museum in Viroqua, it shows the trail that they took, and they had Indians dying along the way that were wounded. They took all of the wounded in Illinois infantry, and they moved them 35 miles up to Fort Winnebago at Portage. And the Native Americans did inflict quite a few deaths on the Illinois. So they chased them across. It took them like 4 days. Their last camp was at Soldiers Grove. That's how that got named, from the Illinois infantry. And they caught up with them at the Bad Axe River, and they slaughtered 400 men, women, and children. Not a good time in America. Winnebago and about 20, or Black Hawk and about 20 of his braves escaped up to La Crosse to the Winnebagos. And so that's just kind of interesting. Here's a battle, here's a book on Wisconsin Heights. It's called The Battle of Wisconsin Heights. And in here it shows the picture. Pass this around. This one is signed, by the way. I like signed books. Next one, I guess. Who was the first white man in Trempealeau County? Ron Wanek's great-great-great-grandfather, James Allen Reed. There's a statue in our park, and there's a statue at Trempealeau. And he was a trapper, frontiersman. He was the first permanent non-native. Next slide. He was an Army veteran. Here's Galesville, Centerville. Little Tamarack goes up here. That's where his cabin was. The last upland elk was shot in French Creek. In French Creek in 1834, we still had upland elk. This is Paul Dettloff's property, going from Arcadia to Blair. On the top of the hill, I'm doing my own archaeological dig under the auspices of my archaeological son, Darby. I'm screening, and the top of the hill, when you go to Blair, if you get on top of that fracking sand, you've been there, Larry, haven't you? If you can see all the way to Hickston. It was a lookout where our house is sitting. See, when they built the road in 1999, or 2000 it was, the road went up to the top of my hill, and there was a natural path there between Hanson's land and my land, and then it went up, and then there was kind of a rounding here, and that's where our house sits, our adobe house, or our Santa Fe style house. We found 4 artifacts just when we dug the foundation. And then on top of that hill was a lookout. Oh, is it ever serene there? You're so at peace when you're up there. And they sat up there and they flint knapped. It's a workshop because there's pounds of chips, pounds of chips. I'm down 6 inches now. And in 6 inches, I got 2 yogurt, in a 4x4 square, I got 2 yogurt containers full of chips. And these chips you can identify from the quarries. We know where all the quarries were. Next slide. We better hurry up. Okay, so what was in the northern third, fourth of Wisconsin? Virgin woods. virgin woods, white pine, maple, and hemlock. In the 18 post-Civil War, who came in to harvest? The Polish, strong Polish people came into Winona and La Crosse, and they went up the Black River, the Wisconsin River, Chippewa River, and St. Croix into the woods in lumber camps. It was really bustling in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. The hemlock was a hardwood, but they harvested the hemlock bark and the cambium for tannins for the, see, about 1860s when they started killing all the buffalo off. And they all didn't go overseas. There were a lot of them that got tanned here. So hemlock was needed. What animal lives with hemlock? Porcupines. When you got hemlock, you got porcupines. We don't have porcupines here. We don't have any hemlock. Anyway, and the white pine was virgin, huge white pine, and then there was maple, which is a hardwood, and they tapped that for sugar. Now, I mentioned that you had to get a lease to mine lead, and that was $1.25 an acre, and it was taken out when you smelt it. The smelters had to pay your lease payment one time, and it was $1.25. That $1.25 acre stayed because after the lead mining and people started moving in the 40s and 50s, they started growing wheat. They started growing wheat, and it was $1.25. That went on until 1862, when Abraham Lincoln said, we're going to have a Homestead Act. We're going to settle the Midwest, and there will be no $1.25 an acre if you live there 5 years and make an improvement. The only way you could get more than 160 acres is if you did not have any woods on your farm. You could get another 40. There's a 40 that fits right into my farm, and that was owned by Twesme's down the road that didn't have any woods. And so they got 160 and a 40 for wood. Interesting. Next slide. Here's the buffalo and here's the beaver. Now, what was the first thing that came into a new town? You had to eat. You had to have flour, so they set up a grist mill. We got one of the mains, the one sitting right out on the edge of Arcadia here. Every town was along a stream. The Indians followed the rivers. That was the roads. The first pioneers had to be by water. They followed the rivers. And every time you get a river with a little sandy knoll, that's probably a campsite. And there's going to be chips there. Or if two rivers meet, if Glencoe hits the Trempealeau River, there's going to be campsites there. Right? So anyway, then they set up sawmills, and they set up a burr mill. A burr mill was the same as a flour mill. They just changed the rocks. So they sawed these white pine into full dimension lumber, full 2 inches, full 10 inch, 12 inch, or 1 inch and 6 inches, and they were rough sawn, and they were called clapboard. And so here's an old barn that they're redoing, and they always put the clapboard vertically, and then they put strips over it, okay? And it was rough sawn, so we got to preserve that from rotting. So they put red paint on it. Where'd they get red paint? They took skim milk, lime dust, and iron oxide, which is red ochre. And everybody knew where the red ochre was because Native Americans mined it for face paint and for their shields. Red ochre is iron oxide, and it's red. And so they decided, let's throw some color in here, and they whitewashed this skim milk with lime dust and red ochre. And when they made the first paint, they thought, well, we got to have red paint for all the buildings. That's how come all these farm buildings were red. It was from the red ochre. Next slide. Okay. All of these big houses in Winona and La Crosse came from the lumber company. The lumber. They built these big monsters This is in Winona. Next slide. Oh, here, hold it. They floated these on, this was a whole industry. There's some really neat books about how they floated these. They would even have a little cabin on here, and they'd ride these. There were no sawmills. Their closest sawmills were at Keokuk, Iowa, Davenport, Iowa. Early on, there wasn't any at Prairie du Chien, and they'd go way down to even to St. Louis, and that's where they got sawn up. But they would ride these all the way down, and that was, and mainly your Polish and German people were your log cutters in the woods. Next slide. I'm going to speed up. Hang on. Here's a sawmill. Keokuk, well, there was some at Prairie du Chien, but in 1860, they estimated in 1860 there was 100 billion board feet growing. And in 30 years, from that 100 billion, they had harvested 66 billion. And what happened then? It grew up into softwoods, into popple, and that's where the paper industry took off. After they harvested, it was the first generation settlement harvesting our natural resources. And that brought a lot of money into the area. Next slide. Here's a grist mill. And here's the big old stone burrs. And they'd get a real hard rock. They'd get a paramagnetic rock, which is fine-grained rock. There's two kinds of rocks. There's diamagnetic and there's paramagnetic. Paramagnetic can absorb energy from the sun because there's calcium, magnesium, potassium, and they all got electrons going around, proton and neutron. And a rock, when it heats up, it picks up energy. And a rock can give off photons of energy. And a paramagnetic rock is a hard rock. Anything that a Native American made an arrowhead or a scraper or a knife or an awl out of was a paramagnetic rock. The diamagnetic rocks were coarse, and so these, you'd put a real heavy paramagnetic granite or basalt or a gneiss in here, and you could grind, that was your burr mill. You could grind flour, but you could grind limestone, is what I'm saying. It took a different burr for limestone than for wheat or oats. Next slide. I should be passing around some of these books here. Here's a book about the Wisconsin lead region. Really interesting. If you've never been down there, that's a very interesting thing. So here's Trempealeau and Buffalo County. And if you look at the towns, all the towns are along a river, okay? You've got Dodge, Arcadia, Independence, Whitehall, Blair, and then you got down here above, you got through Galesville, and that's the pattern. Every big spring, any big spring in the end of a valley, that's where the natives overwintered. And they would stay there for a while until they got all the muskrats and all the raccoon and stuff, and then they would pick up and move maybe 3 miles. In the summer, that place got very smelly, and they would move their little groups around. A lot of our early farmsteads are built on Indian campsites. If you know where my brick house was at the bottom of the hill, going over towards Blair, and that as 5 springs on my farm come out, and the barn sat here. When I got rid of the barn and put a pole building there, we found 4 pieces, 4 complete 3 arrowheads and 1 scraper right where the barn was. That was sitting on a campsite. And so, next slide. Okay, this is the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. In 1831, Cyrus McCormick in Chicago patented a grain for harvesting grain, a reaper. In about 1840, he had a workable one. And a lot of companies in the eastern U.S. had their own grain reaper. This took man with a scythe cutting oats or wheat or barley out of the pitcher. It gave him a mechanical. Next slide. This is how we settled Wisconsin with ox carts and wheat. Wisconsin was a wheat state. Minnesota was a wheat state. My relatives hit Madison, Wisconsin in 1858. 2 Dettloffs were in 4 years in the Civil War, but they were blacksmiths. The youngest one came to Grand Meadow, Minnesota in 1868, and that's where they homesteaded. Next slide. Here is Horde, W.D. Horde, born in Lake Mills, Wisconsin in 1936. He was in the service. He started a little newspaper, and 8 guys got together and said, this wheat is really hard on our soil. Wheat, any monocrop is hard in soil. That's why we have to fertilize the kajibis out of corn, because our organic matter has gone down, our trace minerals have gone, our macro minerals have depleted. And so he said, we are in a glacial landscape and we need to grow grass. And he and 7 other guys started the Horde's Dairymen, proposing that all of our immigrants are from Europe and they're familiar with cattle. We need dairy cows that can eat our grass. Wheat is history. And he became very instrumental with the University of Wisconsin, and he started the Horde's magazine. He heard about this guy in Minnesota, at Chaska, Minnesota, on the southwest corner of the Twin Cities, from Germany. Wendell and Grimm brought a 20-pound bag of lucerne. What's lucerne? Alfalfa. Horde got a hold of some, cultivated it on his farm in Fort Atkinson, took the best genetically, he was harvesting the good ones, and he became kind of a plant geneticist on the part-time, and he introduced alfalfa. And he said, we need alfalfa along with grasses, and let's go have some cows. This is Wendell and Grimm. This became known as Grimm alfalfa to this day. Next slide. Here, and he also said, we got all this waste product from the distilleries. Milwaukee had beer, whiskey. Here's Trempealeau, Wisconsin, 1857. Jacob Michelor had a brewery. What do you do with the brewers? You feed it to cattle. What do you do with distillers? You feed it to cattle. There's nothing you bring on a farm with more poisons and synthesized molecules and feed to a dairy cow than distillers' grain. We just don't think. I wouldn't feed distillers' grain, and it's common, all the distillers' grain. Distillers' grain was discovered to not be real good in the early 1900s when the distilleries in New York, they had a lot of whiskey distilleries in New York, and they had this distillers, whatever they were making out of barley or corn and they had this mash, and all these distilleries had a fence around them, and they'd buy cows and they'd tie them up and they'd feed them as distillers. And these cows were not healthy and they got tuberculosis. And in the early 1900s, 20% of the babies born in New York City didn't make it to 2 years of age because the milk was so filthy. And the city of New York said, Louis Pasteur has the answer. He was the one that discovered bacteria. And that if you pasteurized milk, you killed TB and all these bad bugs. And that's when certified milk came out. Okay, sidelight, next slide. Here is Dr. de Lavelle in 1875 in Sweden developed a centrifuge that spun the heavy stuff separated from the light stuff. It took him till 1890 to get it developed in Sweden. Okay, instead of, he gave the farmer a monthly check when they started separating milk. And the second thing that spawned that they had to have was the farm co-op. The Cooperative Association was developed in Litchfield, Minnesota in the late 1800s, and it was called Land O'Lakes. And the government said this is a taxable entity that farmers can have as a co-op and be a taxable structure and marketing device. with the formation of the co-ops, and the separator took farmers out of subsistence living and gave them a 2-week check. Next slide. This is the plant they built in Poughkeepsie, New York. I'm sorry, I'm at fault. This is a picture of 1906. Comes out of the Wisconsin Dairy Science Group. In 1906, there were 1,649 cheese plants in Wisconsin. That's what W.D. Hort did to the state. There were creameries, 1,017. These were ones that made butter, sold buttermilk. Combined both, there's 40. Skim stations, 260. What was a skim station? I got a whole stack of Hort's Dairymans from 1909 on to 1920 some, and the skim stations were advertising for swatters. And they have a building, and they have big metal trays that are angled, and they have a little spout here, and they just put the milk in there, and they let the cream rise by itself. And they don't want flies in there, and they were hiring women to swat flies, so it didn't get into the, and then they would drain the skim milk off, and they had the cream, and that's what a skim station was. And it's got them all located. It's all located. We were number one in dairy for years and years and years here. Minnesota was number 2. In 1967, when I graduated, Wisconsin was still number 1, Minnesota was number 2, soon to be taken over by California. California cow numbers are going down. I think we will see maybe in 5 years that we will be back number 1. Next slide. 1920, boy, there are the boom years. You know, all these barns and everything, boom years, the roaring 20s. Okay. In 1920, there were 24 million cows in America. Everybody had a house cow. Everybody had a house cow. In 1960, they were down from 24 to 20 million. Okay, in 2023, we dropped below 9 million cows. We dropped below 9 million cows, and we got 5.5 beef cows. 5.5 million is all. When they talk about methane from bovines causing global warming, and we had 24 million cows, and in the 1860s we had 60 million buffalo, all burping. This lady from Minnesota that says we got a problem with cows passing methane doesn't have a clue. Doesn't have a clue. It's not the methane from cows that's global warming. I'm sorry, I had to say that. 29, the stock markets crashed. 30, things plummeted. Dust Bowl was hard. I was born my folks got married in 35. 40, the war years. Everybody was full working. Everybody was working. Next slide. Next slide. In 1950, Europe had a major food shortage. Germany, in this World War II, this is interesting. I got sent over to the Netherlands by Organic Valley. Europe standard for organics is not at our level. The Europeans said you can be organic if you withhold all drugs 3 times the withholding time. So instead of withholding penicillin for 48 hours before you can sell the milk, 48 hours after the shot, you triple it, then you're organic. Well, we were ahead of the program. Organic Valley set up standards. And these were guys, 7 guys at Viroqua that said, we want value-added milk, because 88 was a catastrophe for the dairy industry. 88, there was a movie that came out called Country, and it was when FHA repossessed a farm in North Dakota, and it showed the auction, and it painted a really, really bad scar on FHA. Jessica Lange was in it. And boy, that went through, and it was like the government got a black eye from that. And our accounts receivable at the vet clinic, accounts, 88 was really bad in this area, and it was for the whole industry. So when Germany took over Belgium and the Netherlands, they did it in 1939, and it was called a blitzkrieg. They just moved in, and they were shocked, and they just took over both countries now. And what they did is they took all the animals, chased them to Germany, took all the crops, all the food, and people starved in the Netherlands and in Belgium. Now, Organic Valley had these good rules. California had their good rules, East Coast. And so in 2000, the government said, we're going to standardize the rules. And it took them 2 years, and it's called the National Organic Program. Anybody that's organic in the United States has to comply with this. New Zealand, Australia went along with it. Canada, Europe had their own ball game. China needs milk, needs dairy products, and so they will not buy European organic milk because it has sides. What do sides do? Pesticides, herbicides. What's the two worst sides? Homicide and suicide. It kills cells. And they say, we don't want that. We don't want that. And so the Netherlands, the Netherlands had a contract with China for organic milk, and they couldn't fill it, so they called Organic Valley. Would you fill our organic milk orders for China? And we said, yeah, we will. We had extra milk at the time. And they said, how do you do it? How do you not use antibiotics? And they said, well, we never have. And I happened to be working, and he said, we're going to send Dettloff over there. We'll pay his plane ticket. You feed him and house him. And I put on 7 meetings in Holland. I get up towards Germany, and that was I got a PowerPoint on Holland. If you ever want to see that, I'll come in. But it's very interesting how they farm over there. But I mentioned at the evening at one, I said, boy, we had a lot of people there today. We had people from France and Holland and Germany, and like, there weren't any Germans there. They don't dare come in here. They hate the Germans. And the kids that were born during the Second World War have a very low life expectancy. It showed up in the epidemiologists have said that. So Orville Freeman said, we want to have 1 year's supply of food stored. And in the 50s in southern Minnesota, they put up these Quonsets. Did they hear in Wisconsin where they stored corn and soybeans and you sealed it? We had 6 Quonsets. It's like on Highway 90, this side of Austin, Minnesota, about 5 miles from our farm. Our neighbor was a ventilator. Every day he'd ventilate so it didn't get moldy. And they said, we want 1 year's food stored to eliminate any food storage. Okay? Orville Freeman was a governor from Minnesota. Kennedy put him in as Secretary of Agriculture. A very popular man at the time. 60s were good. Next slide. So, I get into vet school. In 1963, Rachel Carson, who's a marine biologist, writes a book called Silent Spring. We had a young instructor, Dr. Short. This one I'll pass around. This is the first edition. I love first editions. We had a Dr. Short that just came out of graduate school, and he read this book. And he said, everyone in this class is going to read Silent Spring. And we were down to 250 eagles in the United States because the DDT caused no eggshell. They would lay soft eggs, and the eagles wouldn't reproduce. And she wrote Silent Spring. And this was the first major side effect that we kind of like, maybe we shouldn't be doing all this scientific things without checking in that, okay? Before that, After that, Silent Spring, pass that around. That's a classic. That's a valuable book also. So we get into the 60s, and anybody here remember thalidomide children? That was we had two neighbor girls, the Anderson girls, and one was 2 years ahead of me and one was 1 year behind me, and they're born with really short limbs. And this was thalidomide, and thalidomide caused this birth defect. And boy, did that get pulled off the market really quick. Then the third one was diethylstilbestrol. Anybody ever heard of DES babies? Diethylstilbestrol was a hormone that I used like water in 1967. Any cow that didn't pass her placenta, you gave them a shot of diethylstilbestrol. If you had feedlot Angus heifers and you didn't want any of them bred because you're feeding them for meat, for Angus meat, and they were pregnant, you gave them a big shot of diethylstilbestrol and it would abort them before they went into the feedlot. Well, Our Stolen Future was written by Diane Demunsky, Theo Colburn, and they figured out what was happening. We had a whole generation of young girls being born without a cervix or one uterine horn or no ovaries. Their reproductive system was really messed up, and they were infertile. They were infertile. And where did this come from? And these three people met at an Earth Day conference in 1954 in Racine, Wisconsin, and they said, we have no clue, let's go back and go to work and start asking questions. What they found out, they were using it to prevent miscarriages. And if you got diethylstilbestrol between, and I'm going to put this up on the board because this is, I haven't used this board yet and I feel bad they hold it in here. And I'm going to use red. Okay? Between the 9th week and the 13th week of pregnancy, if you got DES, you had a really good chance to have an infertile daughter. And I put this in red. Red means danger. That's why women wear red lipstick, guys.
Be careful, Paul.
Anyway, I suppose you're going to quit now. Anyway, this really went through the medical community. This really went through the medical. This is a hormone, and hormones are parts per trillion. You don't need a whole bucket full of diethylstilbestrol. When BGH hit in the dairy world, 75% of the veterinarians were against it. Probably 50% of the farmers were against it. We're in an oversupply of milk, and they wanted to increase production of milk by using a hormone. And we were trained that hormones work in parts per trillion, and they never did any research to know how much of the BGH hormone appeared in the milk, because it did appear in the milk. Now, I didn't want my their daughters drinking BGH milk, and I stood up in a meeting at Blair, and I said, I think we ought to not use BGH, it's a hormone, and there was a guy from the state extension that laughed me out of the room. And when you know you're right, you do it, and I knew I was right on that one. But these two saved a lot of women. She's written 8 books, and I've got them all. Next slide. So, Earl Butts, get big or get out. Fence row to fence row. Fence row to fence row. That was the demise of diversified farming. Every little farm in Minnesota in the 50s had chickens, pigs, and cows. Every little farm in Wisconsin. First thing that left were chickens. Second thing was pigs. Pigs. We butchered our own pigs. My mother rendered lard. I did not see a bar of ivory soap until I went to school in town. She made her soap. Anybody had homemade soap? There's got to be some of you old folks do. I got chicken pox, and we didn't have a bathtub. We had an outhouse. And I went over to my aunt's to take a bath for chicken pox and that. And oh God, I just love that ivory soap. You know, I'm going to stretch this as long as I can. You know? I got a question nobody's ever been able to answer. Why did everybody plant hollyhocks by the old outhouse? Did you have hollyhocks by your outhouse? Our country school had hollyhocks. My grandma had hollyhocks. Why? What was the deal with hollyhocks around an outhouse? Well, you're a dumb crowd. I don't know. Don't you just wonder something sometimes? You know, when you wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning, this comes out of my think tank. At 3 o'clock in the morning, you have your RNA and DNA, the spiral, there's helical spirals where your chromosomes are on there. That expands 7%, and this is coming from the universe. It expands 7% at 3 o'clock in the morning. If you're ever going to have a clairvoyant thought or a good idea, you write it down because you won't remember it in the morning. And it shrinks back down at 3 o'clock. This is not savings time, this is normal time. 3 o'clock in the afternoon, it shrinks 7%. That's when you should let school out. And I'm going to quit before 3 o'clock. Anyway, so in the 70s, boy, we had new drugs coming out every month. Every month. It was just the chemical companies and the pharmaceutical companies were in high gear with this technology. We were sitting on the edge of our chairs waiting what's next. And I was right in the front row of that church. I wanted to know what's next. Next one. So then, first ones to go were the chickens. Swine went. Nearly all the swine is owned by the packer now. You put up a building, you can use your own grain and soybeans to feed, but all of the, nobody hauls pigs into Hormel or any plant anymore. It's all through contracts. And it's so sophisticated. I've got classmates that got these buildings that hold 600 pigs, where they'll have a big 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 6 times 8. So there's 4,800 pigs here on concrete with manure underneath that puts off methane. So you got to have fans to blow off the methane. The re-rotted concrete is an equal potential plane. Everything that conducts electricity is hooked together. The fans, you got fans up above to blow off the ammonia from the manure. And they're variable speeds fans that put on electromagnetic field. These pigs are living in an electrical Auschwitz. Stray voltage like you can't believe. And now we put a windmill farm amongst them. A windmill has so much torque, they have 35 feet of re-rod buried. Thousands of pounds of re-rod buried, and it's grounded. And that's sitting there next to this pig building. I do not want to be a pig. The pig is supposed to get 60% of their diet underground with their nose. Pigs get bored, and pigs are smart. What we're doing to the pig, I just cry for them. Dairy cattle, we're locking them up. We're locking them up. Next slide. Troubled water over the farm products market in the world. And the 80 came along. The 88 farm bankruptcies. I talked about this already. 88, I planted 20,000 trees, and I had 5,000 of them grow. They dried out. Next slide. Organic Valley started in the Midwest here. They were one of the pioneers. They met at the Vernon County 7 farmers. And they first started with produce. They grossed $98,000 in produce, growing cabbage and squash. And there was a 65-year-old guy that came in and he said, I almost died from spraying my corn.
And I came home 5 years ago and I said, I'm going to farm like Grandpa. He said, I'm not going to use anything. He said, if you want organic milk, I think you got it. Oh, another guy said, you know, let's start doing milk. And so they started with 1 truckload of milk and they took it to a cheese plant and they made it cheddar cheese and they drove around these guys with it in their trunk. You want some cheese? You got a little store? You want a few blocks of cheese? They started from the ground up. Then one guy said, you know, I could use some milk. So they contracted with somebody to bottle milk. On Friday, we take the milk to him. On Tuesday, we take the milk to him, and we get cheese and milk, and it just kind of grew. And they're the ones that said, we don't want any antibiotics. We don't want any chemical fertilizers. We don't want any hormones. And so that began the whole thing. Now, the organic world is, you know what the fastest group of farmers, growing farmers in the United States are today? Quietly, nobody is aware of this except those connected in the organic world. The Amish and Mennonites, as we sit here tonight, are buying up the state of Missouri. They go to where there's cheap land. Northern Maine was potato country. And when you have potatoes on potatoes on potatoes, if you run out of boron, have you ever opened up a potato and you got a black spot in the middle? That's a boron deficiency. You got to have boron and you got to have calcium to get rid of that black spot. And potatoes will get the minerals out of the soil, and so they built a big French fry plant north of Boston, which is right by Maine, and they grew potatoes in Maine until they couldn't grow them anymore, and they all drove away. Cheap land. And it all grew up into poppled. And they came in there, the Amish, and they got one of these Fjord tractors like Belasheski's got, 700 horse, and they put a big grinder, a diamond tooth grinder, and they would grind up rocks and trees, and it was just high powered, and and it pulverized it, and it looked like beautiful soil. And the Amish take care of their soil. When you get a soils talk at the Amish, they listen. And when you say you've got to balance your base saturation of calcium, magnesium, potassium, they say, okay, how do I do it? California, I'd go put a meeting on, and they'd all go home. And there was a party. I hated going to California for all those big organic guys. They were in it for the money. The Amish are in it for a lifestyle. And they are so logical that they are the fastest growing group of farmers in the United States. And they're continuing to grow. Layers and broilers, we know that, they followed suit. We entered the world market. Next slide. William Albrecht. I got introduced by William Albrecht by Robert Schmidnick. Oh, there you are. I asked him one day what I needed for my trees. I planted 40,000 walnut trees in French Creek, and I have 20,000 doing really well. I didn't know walnut trees needed good corn ground, and Bob was a client of mine. I hardly ever got there because his herd was healthy. He figured this soil things out, and I called him one day and I said I was conventional Dettloff, and I was looking for the magic bullet to put on 20,000 walnut trees. There'd be a little knob, and they were 8 years old, and they were this high with 27 leaves, and 6 of them were yellow. And over there, they were 20 feet high. And I wanted the magic bullet that Bob had here. And I said, what do I need? And he said, what are you going to do Tuesday? I said, I'm going to be taking calls. He said, no, you're not. You're going to ride along with me. Me and a guy from Lewiston, Minnesota. Boy, that started my education. Ron Wanek told me this when we had industrial development. I go, surround yourself with smart people and listen. And a lot of them don't know what to do. Then you direct them. That's what made Ron successful. I listened to Gary Zimmer for 15 years, didn't we? And I learned how to balance soil. It all starts in the soil. And our soil, and folks in the United States, is in tough shape. With Roundup, we have killed all the microbes. We have dead soil. And we are going to pay dearly for what we're doing to our soil. It just will happen. It just will happen. William Albrecht in 1930 said, what do I need in the soil to grow a full-stemmed, high bricks. This is solids in the silent fold, the sugar, the minerals and everything, highly mineralized grass or hay. And he did science, and he found out that your soil has a negative charge, and the cations, calcium, magnesium, potassium, and sodium, stick to the soil. And you want them in the right proportion. And you want to have a pH of 6.5 to 6.8, and you want to have trace elements, and you need boron, and you need sulfur. Anything that's got a negative charge in our negative soil leaches. And when we had 50-some inches of rain on my farm 5 years ago, a lot of these cornfields that had a little knob on them, the farmer said, oh, I ran out of nitrogen there. No, you didn't. The 50 inches of rain took sulfur out, because sulfur doesn't hook onto the soil. Now we're learning in the conventional world we need sulfur to grow corn. All of a sudden everybody's adding sulfur, and that's good science. This guy was the guy that started it all. Next slide. Okay. It's not all gloom and doom. The human population isn't as healthy as it used to be. We've lost our work ethic. Soil erosion is rampant. Corporate America, President Eisenhower said we have to be aware of the military military industrial complex controlling us. We have now a governmental industrial. We now have a governmental medical industry controlling us. See how many ads we got on TV? The drug ads, it's just, synthesized molecules are appearing in the majority of our foods. And anything that's synthesized acts like a foreign subject to us. If it isn't made by photosynthesis, it doesn't have the frequency of life in it. And our body will recognize anything that's grown in nature as not being harmful. You take the aspirin that Bayer makes, acetylsalicylic acid is just exactly like what's in a willow or another plant I can't think of. The willow has natural aspirin, and it will not cause a side effect. Bayer's aspirin, if you take too much, and I see it in these dairy cows where you give a 240 grain aspirin, and the guy doesn't stop using them, so I got this cow on 240 grain aspirins, 2 of them night and morning for a week, and they got black manure. They got an abomasal ulcer he's created. And it's because it's natural, it's synthesized. In 1900, we had 76 million people. 1960, 180. Look at here. We're at 350, going up. 80% of our population are 5 generations away from agriculture. And I saw that and I told Joan, I don't think so. And she said, Paul, look at Megan's husband. Hasn't been a farmer in that for years. Look at Marcia's husband. Nobody's farmed. Teddy Roosevelt said, the further away you get from Mother Nature, the less common sense you have. And you have I call them domestic chores. And so my domestic chore was about 3 years ago to go along with my wife to the Mall of America. Well, that's about the last place I wanted to be, but I was supposed to see my granddaughter and son-in-law and daughter, and I said, okay, I'll go to the Mall of America. So I sat. To be a good veterinarian, you have to be a good observer. See what you look at. And if you aren't a good observer, and we hired a vet one time that didn't have a clue. He was not an observer. We hired him for a year and he was gone. So you're trained to be a good observer. And so I was observing. And here's these kids with these pants hanging way the hell down, walking around. And I want to go over and just zoom. And then this one guy walked up by, and I thought, if I had a magnet, I could get that to stick to him. I mean, he had stuff coming out of his ears and nose, and I thought. And then they got these tattoos all over. Who's going to hire these people? They need to have a garden and 30 chickens or a bunch of pigs and get back to life. Teddy Roosevelt was so right. I should quit preaching. Oh gosh. Next slide. Okay, we're getting there. We have positive.
our younger people are so smart. They're educated, they got the world at their fingertips with Google. I do know how to Google. That's the only thing I do know how to. We have a population of young educated that are powerfully focused and aren't for sale. And that is reflected in our females. I would go down to Organic Valley once a month, and the rest of the time I was around the United States, and I would meet these young, beautiful, educated girls, smart. I mean, they all had education, and we have estrogenized our male with estrogen mimickers and estrogen blockers. In the 50s, when you got run over, you bit the tire and you got the license number. That male doesn't exist anymore. That male does not exist anymore. We have obese kids with no get, the males. It's really evident. Just become an observer. Go to the Mall of America. You need to do that, Russell. Okay. Microbiology is really important in the soil. That has just been awakening in the last 3-4 years. The microbiology. When you break down, you know how many ergs it takes for a seed to germinate? 300 ergs. That's energy raised per gram of soil. When you put a seed in the ground, a seed will not germinate until it picks up 300 ergs of energy. How do you get energy in the soil in the spring? With microbes, bacteria, fungi, lichens, the whole list. I got a presentation for Organic Valley with all the microbes, and what do? We make big carbon molecules for photosynthesis. This is something I'll put on the board. Who stole my rep? Oh, here.
I got it beside the book.
Pass this around. Trempealeau County history, 1917, rewritten in 78. Dr. Pierce, an MD in, you want to take a look at it or pass it back? Pass that around, that I treasure that. Okay, photosynthesis, and then I'll let you go. We're a carbon-based molecule. What does that mean? We have a double bond on this carbon chain. Now you're going to make a protein. Protein needs nitrogen. So you've got a leaf, and you got stomata on the bottom, and you got CO2 coming in, and you've got chlorophyll with magnesium, and chlorophyll says we're going to build a protein. So here's nitrogen. 70% of our air is nitrogen. Here's nitrogen, okay? Here's N2, here's N, and there's sulfur. 10% of the protein needs sulfur, so it builds this. When it hooks nitrogen on here, it's hooked with energy from the sun. And when the chlorophyll puts a frequency, there's a frequency. Everything has a frequency. All 92 elements have a frequency. From the electron spinning around the proton and neutron. Hydrogen has one electron going around. If they're a positive molecule, it goes counterclockwise, and it has 3 times the energy as a negative because it goes this way. Okay, so we have all 92 elements. You can figure the energy level by how many protons and how many electrons they have. So now, this is a cornstalk with a big carbon molecule, and bacteria and microbes break this and they liberate energy. And that's how you get energy in the soil, is through rotting and breaking down. Now this can be a carbohydrate, this can be an enzyme, this can be a sugar, and they hook on. When you look at a cornfield, 95% of the biomass in a cornfield comes from the air. And we're burning up carbon dioxide, taking it out of the air, and we're giving off oxygen.
and why we're cutting all these trees down along the road in Trempealeau County befuddles me. Befuddles me. You people in Buffalo County are lucky. We got a county that is going way out and cutting everything down. We should be planting trees, and they're way out. I did file a complaint. Didn't go very far. Okay, carbon-based molecules. A seed needs 300 ergs of energy, and it gets it from the microbes. In our dead soil, it takes longer to germinate a seed. When you put corn in the ground, organic corn, you wait until the ground temperature is 70 degrees. The microbes wake up at 50. Corn germinates at 70. And if you put corn in the ground, the last guy to plant corn, corn should be out of the ground in 4 days. In 4 days. And when I drive through Iowa and I see snowbanks on the edge, and April 28th, they're all planting corn, you should go fishing. Okay. We need food density of nutrients is being focused on. Now here's an observation that I noticed traveling America. I get out and I'm consulting with an Amish firm in Pennsylvania, and land is 15 to 20,000 an acre. Every Amish farmer foliar sprays. Foliar sprays nutrients onto the plant. And it increases the bricks, it increases the nutrient density. All your big produce companies foliar spray, and they also, through the irrigation, will feed minerals through the irrigation. Land, when it hits $10,000 an acre, they start foliar spraying. I just put a meeting on December 3rd in northern Indiana, where corn grounds 15,000 an acre. This big company that's a distributor for Megan, we had 196 Amish in one room. And they pay attention, and they're all starting to foliar spray. When land hits 10,000 an acre here, hang on. It's in my book. I have a whole section on foliar spray. And so things are changing in agriculture. You're getting more CSAs, more farmers market. The biggest growth that Megan's getting and Dr. Paul's is the help me with this word.
Backyard.
The farmer,
The backyard.
Community support.
Backyard.
what?
Backyard.
Yeah, backyard,
Homesteaders.
I'll think of it.
Community support.
Yeah, the community, you're
Homestead.
really frustrating. But the farmer that he's either working in town or she's a nurse practitioner, they're making 100,000, they got 1 or 2 kids, and the first thing they'll start with is chickens and a big garden. And Jersey, they'll get 2 Jersey A2 cows to give their kids A2 milk. A2 is coming on. So homesteaders, they're homesteaders. See, I get it. Yeah. So anyway, they're really growing. These CAFOs, I'm sorry, but they're fossil fuel hogs. They got so many fans and so much. The Amish got 10 kids and they got horses. They pay attention to their soil. They don't have any overhead. I've had more and more Amish come up to me and say, I never thought I could make so much money with 50 cows. With 50 cows. And you don't see Amish that are obese. They eat. They have big gardens. They have a work ethic. I admire way over half of Megan's business is Amish and Mennonites. I think 60% of Organic Valley's milk is coming from they call them plain folks. They're diversified farming, soil. Animal fat is back. Plant fat, we ate animal fat, the Eskimos and that, and animal fat is not related to cholesterol, I'm sorry. We have a world protein shortage and it's getting worse. Protein is milk and meat. And so I see good times coming as our population increases. We're covering a lot of land over with concrete and houses and pavement and so we have a world shortage of milk and meat, and grass-based food is going to come back in the future. Next slide.
Summary. Small dedicated groups have consistently changed the world. And I talked to the pork producers in the Midwest, and this was what I said. And these 8 guys in Vernon County have changed. They started the whole organic movement. Small dedicated groups have always changed history. Don't ever forget it. This is the hog that they used to have. Lard. I was raised on, I got lard sandwiches once a week in my little wholemeal pail. And you know what makes lard sandwiches good? Mustard. My
Take a
mother-
lot of it.
Huh?
Take a lot of it.
No, homemade bread and lard and mustard. I figure it was an advantage to be born poor.
Yeah,
I really do. That's all I have, I think, isn't it? You didn't slip any new slides in. I think we ought to thank her for helping me put this together. A little fireball librarian, she's really taken this library to a new level. I appreciate what you're doing. I do have more talks if you want them sometime. I have a talk on dairying in New Zealand and dairying in Holland. I took a lot of pictures there. They're doing a lot of different things in other parts of the world that we don't do here. We're going to start putting in herbal hedgerows with Organic Valley. A herbal hedgerow is an island of plant that's full of medicinals. It'll have willow trees, and it'll have, I can't find a hackberry tree, but it'll have all perennial plants. And the cows will be able to graze it with this cable, and then twice a year you let the cable down and you let them go in and eat the plants. They can have echinacea, they can have yarrow, they can have St. John's wort. We're just going to have a whole medicinal island. And so, anyway, thank you. It's been a good job.